Hi, everyone. I'm Rick Barron, your host, and welcome to my podcast, That's Life, I Swear. My guest today is Jenny Chan. Jenny is a director at Pacific Atrocities Education, a San Francisco-based nonprofit dedicated to preserving and researching the overlooked and often the uncomfortable truth of what happened during World War II, and more so in the Pacific War. Now, her organization doesn't just document history. It challenges us to question it, research it, and understand how the past continues to shape the world we live in today. Now, over the past decade, Jenny and her team have worked with hundreds of interns, survivors, scholars, and students to uncover stories rarely taught in textbooks, such as forced labor camps and forgotten resistance fighters. Also to the ripple effects of political decisions that still echo across Asia today. Now, as I was exploring the website that Jenny's organization has pulled together, I came across one line that I found very powerful. Simple, but very powerful. Remember history to see the future. Think about that. In an era where headlines move faster than understanding, Jenny will remind us that context is not optional. It's essential. That research is not just about the facts, but about empathy, and that every action in history creates a reaction that shapes generations. That said, please join me as I have my conversation with Jenny Chan. Jenny, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Well, I've been looking forward to this conversation ever since I came across your website, and I've been going through the pages, looking at all the updates that come to mind, and it's what I found really fascinating is that I used to create websites back in the day. So looking at what you have created, that's a lot of work. That is a lot of work. But maybe for the benefit of the audience, could you kind of walk us through your background and where you are today with this organization?
Yeah, so I founded this organization in 2014. So it's been 10 years of this kind of website work and also updating from things that I have found in the National Archives. I started the organization because my grandma, when I was a kid, had always told me about World War II. But then a little did I realize that Pearl Harbor and what she was describing were actually the same war. Um, if you think about it, like 8 hours after Pearl Harbor, Hong Kong was attacked. But in the West, we don't really learn about World War II in terms of in terms of the Pacific War. The Pacific War, we watch one movie on Pearl Harbor, and then the rest is about Hitler. And so I didn't realize, and when I was a kid, I really loved anime, and my grandma was, every time I was watching anime, my grandma was very upset, and I was thinking like, wow, maybe she's a little bit prejudiced against certain people, and I don't know why. I couldn't figure it out why. And after she died, we found the whole box of like military yen and like rice rationing coupon, and that's when I realized that okay, so like maybe what she was talking about, because that's when I saw physical proof. And that's when I was like, oh, maybe what she was talking about in terms of like the Japanese were these evil turnip heads who came over and like were really brutal. Maybe there's some truth to that. And so then I started, and after college, I had this really boring job. And I was reading more into World War II in Asia, specifically, like The Rape of Nanking, The Rising Sun by John Toland, and also like um, The Factory about Unit 731. And what I realized is that like the war in Asia was very brutal. Like what my grandma experienced is like very typical of an experience in Asia. 30 million people died, basically. That's like the lower estimate. And the higher estimate was 42 million. And then I was, after like finding all these facts, I was like, oh, maybe there's like a organization dedicated to researching, and maybe I can be an analyst there. Maybe I can make some website for them. Upon my research, there's none. If you can find me an organization that does that, that'll be great. Then maybe I can work for them instead of, doing what I'm doing now. And so, yeah.
So are you the founder of this organization or?
Yes, I was the
Ah,
co-founder
okay.
because I convinced my friend into it because I had no idea how to, make websites and whatnot. And my friend is now moved on and working in AI industry. And yeah, so I'm was the co-founder, and that was the starting story.
So when you were putting this website together, and that it takes a lot of work, how to organize it, how to present it. Uh, what what went on the whiteboard, so to speak, as to how you were going to design this site so that people not only read the information, looked at the pictures, but walked away with a feeling of, my God, I had no idea.
Yeah, so in the beginning, I did more of oral history interviews because that was more accessible because it was still 2014 and a lot of survivors were still alive. And so a lot of the beginning of those were more blog posts. And then we needed to drive traffic. What is that thing called? It was not Reddit. It was something else. It was a forum that I posted about. Like, I kind of compare the Yasukuni Shrine, which is like a shrine where Japan dedicated their wartime World War II like war criminals. They had like a shrine for that, and I kind of compared it with like the Confederate flags and
Right.
how America kind of certain places in America still kind of worship the Confederate generals, and that got really heated. Oh, discuss. That was on the discuss forum, and then they even invited me to like start my own little sub channel, and I was thinking, oh, I don't really have time for that. Um, And so I didn't do that. But then I realized that like we can compare things like that. And so to draw traffic and whatnot. And then I was thinking about like what are things that I really want to do research on. So I went to China and visited some of these comfort women who were basically like sex slaves in World War II. And I went to Shanxi and interviewed them. And then like it took me 2 years to digest what they were telling me, and I wrote a book afterward, like after 2 years. Unfortunately, by that point, most of them have already passed away. And so I was doing blog posts about that. And then in 2018, I started doing more like primary sources because in when we were posting on Instagram and whatnot, people would accuse me of being CCP and blah, blah, blah. And so I thought, well, then we need to find more, Western documents of what had happened in World War II in Asia. And I realized that because the United States had occupied Japan, that the United States had kept a lot of the records during the occupation. So I started doing more research and doing digitizing and scanning and writing more blog posts that way, and then also having more resource pages that way. And we have scanned in the last like 7 years over 1 million pages from the National Archives. And then it started to be too much that even our website can't take it. And so then we started a subsequent thing on Omeka. So then for those who are interested in wanting to have more raw material for the next research, they can feel free to go on our Omeka reclaim hosting archive page.
So going back to the Chinese women you were talking about, uh, that must have been a very, I guess, absorbing, interesting, almost a very sad moment to be hearing their stories about what happened to them. What did you feel after you collectively pulled all this information together and hearing what they shared with you about what happened to them?
Yeah, so it's I feel like their suffering like had like three is more like a three-part tragedy. First, they were captured and they were basically used as sex slaves for these military people. Like this woman even showed me where she was captured. It was like in a it's now like an abandoned building, but you can just like feel the amount of suffering that she had gone through. And like every day she was being raped by like 10 to like 15 soldiers at the time. And it was like in 1942. And afterward, when she was out, like her husband didn't want her anymore. And this is like a time too that people really marry young. I think she was like 16. This is one of the women that I interviewed. She was like 16 when she was married. And then like later, after being captured and then like a whole year, then she was released and then her husband didn't want her anymore. And then she was kind of like ostracized by the town. And she was then also pregnant. And then her mom was like, "Oh, let's go to like the nearest like area where we can bury your child and then just forget about it." And so it's like for me, it took a lot for me to like absorb these stories because it's like it's part of China that I've never been to. Um, they all had like Mao in their living room. And I grew up in the United States. I was taught that Mao is like evil and whatnot, was evil and whatnot. And then she was like, "No, government has done a lot for me more so than like people immediately like next to me have done." And that's when I was like questioning the narrative that I have been taught in like the last, you know, decades of my life. And yeah, it took a lot for me to like also interview them too because it shattered the narrative I had in my mind. And also like hearing their suffering, it takes a lot to digest that kind of story.
Oh, I can only imagine. I mean, for this one lady you were talking about, where she was constantly being raped at such a young age, I can't imagine what that does to the psyche of that individual, the raw emotions of wondering what's going to happen to me tomorrow and the day
And
after.
she didn't
Yeah, it's just,
and she didn't talk about it for like the longest time. Because she had to move on with her life and she was being ostracized. And when you're being ostracized by your village, I think the last thing you want to talk about is your wartime experience. And that's why I think it's kind of been silenced for so long.
I can understand that. Wow, that's and that's just only one of many stories that you are uncovering and your team. Now, looking at your website, I see you've called out that you've interviewed, as you already have, survivors, students, scholars. But what caught me was the interns that come to work for you, and I think that they do it for free, if I'm not mistaken. And what's the process for training that individual to be an intern, and what did they do? What did they bring to the organization to help you guys out?
So some of the interns are paid by their college internship program, and others get credit. And it's mostly for public history. So they learn how to like uh, do sort out archives. And then they also learn to do background stories and background narrative of what had happened and research more into what had like the untold stories of World War II. And so like I have feedbacks from professors who because every spring we do kind of a partnership with USF with their public history internship class. And this is like the third professor I've worked with now. And it's always been very positive that our organization is actually talking about things that, normal people have no idea. Like the narrative has no idea like about what had happened. Like, for example, this professor is very educated, but she had no idea why Japan was in Vietnam. And one of our research project is about that, about the resources that was in Southeast Asia and why Japan had to be in Vietnam for that. And so an intern can also go through our the resources that we have. For example, another intern looked through the Yokohama trial and learned about like human experimentations that were happening with the POWs who were captured. And so she like was writing blog posts and making videos on our YouTube channel for that. It's a lot of analytical work as well, because you have to analyze like what was happening and what the document was saying, and also provide like background information of what was happening when when this period of war was happening. So yeah, and I think students really like to collect facts and really analyze the situation and also like the historical context for themselves.
Sure. Now, I would imagine, you have requirements for someone who wants to be an intern, but do you take it to a degree where you have, I mean, such a passion for what you're doing that you want the intern to have that same passion? Like, you're not just here just so you can get credit. I want you to
Right.
understand, what you're going to be doing, not only for us, but for people who will understand the real history that's been hidden for so many years.
Yeah. Yes. And I've had like past interns who are now professors. And one of the past interns like was very passionate about interviewing these women in the Central Coast in California who moved here after World War II, but they were actually fighting in World War II. Like we normally don't think about women as fighters, but I guess this is March, so we can talk about international women, heroics. And what was interesting is that she did it in also like in the 2010s, so that these women were still alive, and she was able to go in and interview them like almost every weekend. She drove in and she spent so much time with them that they were then like kind of like family. She was like watching drama with them, and then be like, oh, so what were you doing at that age and whatnot. And so then it became kind of like a community for her to even record these stories. And had she not done that, those stories would have been lost, because a lot of the family members didn't even know that like grandma fought against the Japanese during World War II. And it's those are like very powerful stories, not to just read, but also like to record, so then other people can know about what had happened.
Yeah, I think the recording, is so valuable because you're actually hearing the voice of history that went through all this. And I have to wonder, well, let me ask you this question. When you started doing all this research and a lot of the work that the interns do, what did you come across that, I guess, surprised you, stunned you about? I never had any idea that this took place during the Second World War, more so with Japan and China. What, nugget did you find that, my gosh, this story needs to be told, but I still can't believe I found this?
I think that for me was actually post-war.
Hmm.
I know, like, you know, the post-war situation was pretty like nasty, I would say, in terms of politically. Like America knew what was happening. So during the war too, actually it was part before in the 1930s. So Rockefeller Institute scientists alerted the OSS about how a Japanese scientist was trying to steal a strand of yellow fever. Uh, a strand of yellow fever. And the guy's name was Naito Ryuichi. And then later I realized that he was like the second in command of Unit 731. And he figured out how to like powderize anthrax. And I still remember from like my childhood that like anthrax was like a hot topic. And so when I was reading up like these documents, I'm like, whoa, I didn't know that anthrax had like an origin of like World War II and Unit 731. And this is where it came from. And then after the war too, even though that the United States knew exactly what Japan was up to, they sent like 3 investigators to negotiate with these Japanese scientists who were basically like waging this biological warfare onto the world, and they allowed them immunity, and they did their cover up for them. So it's almost like they did their bidding for them. And like what really shocked me is that like one of the investigator who eventually was like, this is such valuable information that we cannot let our enemies have it, and whatnot. And so then, and the scientists work at Fort Detrick at the time, and so they acquired the finding for Fort Detrick. And lately, I've been doing like some more research on Fort Detrick and scanning more of the documents, and this is pretty dark. And just like how Ishishiro was from Unit 731 from Japan was subcontracting a lot of his biological like research out to like other universities. Fort Detrick started doing the same with a lot of the academics and whatnot. And so then the academics would get like pieces of what they're researching, but they have no idea that will contribute to like a bigger, broader piece of like biological research. And so after I realized that, I'm just like, I know that we have Geneva Convention, but like who is there to protect all of us for the next biological like attack or, whatever that could happen. So that got really dark for me. It's scary to think about.
It is. Going through your website, though, it's kind of a good segue. I came across the story about Unit 731. You kind of touched on that. Could you explain it to the audience what that was all about? Because it was very frightening.
So Unit 731 was this biological weapons lab that was happening in occupied Manchuria. It wasn't, so the guy who started it, Ishishiro, was actually like I would call, if he was alive today, I'll call him a technocrat, to be honest, because he was reading the Geneva Convention, and he thought, well, if germ is so powerful that people need to write rules about it, then we need to harness it so then Japan can become a world power. So he kind of saw it as like a kind of a tech tool. And he also knew that in the Russo-Japanese War, the reason why Japan was going down so fast was because of clean water issue. And so he actually created this water filter. And he had a demonstration to the emperor, and he basically peed in his water filter that he produced, and he drank his own pee that was filtered, and the emperor was so impressed that he immediately gave funding to this guy. So at first he started his lab in Tokyo, but then he knew that if he was going to continue this in Tokyo, even though that he had the emperor blessing, he's going to find out. People are going to find out sooner than later, and popular opinion will drown him. So he already knew what he was doing is so bad that like he can't do it in his own country. So when Japan took over Manchuria, he thought, wow, this is like my perfect opportunity to do this kind of work. It's there because it's more remote. No one's ever going to find out, and so let's go move my lab there. He took like a summer trip over there, like a summer road trip over there, and he first established it in this like factory. But his during like Autumn Moon Festival, his guards were drinking so much that like some of the prisoners got out, and he was thinking like, okay, well, if I get found out here, then popular opinion is also going to drown me. So he found another more secret location and installed his brother as like the prison guard. And so he took over this one village, evicted all the villagers out, built like buildings around it, so then he can do like his human experimentation labs. He also had like these testing grounds where he would tie prisoners to the stakes and like test his flea bomb. He was producing flea bombs with like plague and whatnot. And he was also incentivizing villagers to like breed rats. He will pay people for rats, so then he can like get more fleas to produce more flea bomb. And even like after the war, you can see that when like Sandra Murray was like interviewing him. He was Marie Sanders. Yeah, I think so. That's his name. He was basically saying like, oh yeah, in the beginning of my testing, I used to use steel, and then I realized that the steel doesn't shatter, so then I ended up using like porcelain to make sure that these like flea bomb would like actually shatter, and the flea can actually like spread the plague. And like that kind of detail is kind of sickening. To be
Wow.
honest. Because it's just like, okay, this guy not only figured out like how to like actually produce these kind of weapons, he's actually trying to figure out like the most effective way to disseminate and distribute this weapon. And what was also sickening is that like they kind of just saw other people that weren't Japanese as like test subjects. So then they were calling them like marutas, so like logs, because they were so desensitized about what was happening to these people. And like experiments, if you go look at like their the reports that later Fort Detrick obtained, like the plague, for example, when they were testing the plague, their samples, like the N, age from like 3-year-old to like 81-year-old. So it's like a lot of young or old, they don't care. They just wanted to see how the plague would react to people's bodies. And so yeah, it's a lot of disturbing things that was happening at that time. And after the war, the Soviets were doing Operation August Storm, and they stormed into Manchuria. Like a lot of the scientists did not believe that was happening. But Ishishiro was like burning down all of the evidence, but then took some key documents with him. And a few of the scientists actually got caught by the Soviets for the Khabarov trial. I cannot pronounce Russian words. Bear with me here, Khabarov's trial. But then, like, the West called it like communist propaganda and never really acknowledged it. But like, I believe that Soviet Union also then started doing their own biological research as well, because they took a lot of like in 1974 in Soviet Union there was an anthrax leak. Because they probably took the results from Unit 731 scientists that they took as prisoners and tried to produce those results as well. So yeah, it's like what I was saying earlier about like biological weapon. I don't think anyone's protecting us from it.
Do you find that as you're going through all this research, and that's a fascinating story. I'm sure there's a lot more to share on that. do you find that where you look where you are today versus those who went through all this, that, you know, these survivors are now starting to disappear? They're passing away. So that said, how do you go forward once you know that, well, there's only like one or two here, one or two there? Do you just start going through documents, letters, and try to piece a story together? I would
Yes.
imagine that's a lot of work.
Yeah, that's what we started doing. And we went through like the Yokohama trial, and we realized that like one of the POWs who was actually captured by the Japanese were also used as human experimentation. I think I mentioned that earlier. And like one of the grandnephew actually wrote me on the contact us page, like wrote me a whole like thing saying that like this guy was one of the three in his family, one of the three siblings in his family, and the war basically took away 1/3 of his family. Um, yeah, and so like that really became more humanized for me. It's quite. I think it's about like even though that the stories have been so silenced for so long, there were humans that were being impacted by these stories, and there were definitely like people who were affected by these consequences.
Going back to the interns for a moment and what you've been sharing with me, I have to imagine that they are finding similar stories, gathering the research, putting it in order such that it could be displayed either on your website or through presentations. Did they ever talk to you in private about what they found, and more so being absolutely stunned that why aren't we taught any of this in the classroom?
Yeah, and it's quite interesting how certain interns take it. It depends on where they're coming from. Um, and more so recently, I realized that a lot of young people really don't trust the government anymore, especially like realizing the cover-ups and also like, what the American government has been kind of doing for the last decades. And it's very sad in a way. For example, the one of our intern was very shocked because her father was actually like served in the Navy, and she had no idea about World War II in the Pacific. And then she was talking to him about like how this B-29 pilot was then used for human experimentation. Like his lung was removed, and then they can like see how long he can last without his organs. And this was like done in front of like college settings. It was like a college campus lecture. And at one time, because Ishishiro was such a successful man, that he got so much money from the emperor that everyone looked up to him. Um, and so everyone wanted to do human experimentation in Japan. And after the war, they kind of just put his like um death. They didn't say that he died on like human experimentation table. They said that he was one of the death toll from Hiroshima POW camp. And like that finding was very shocking for one of my intern. Was like, wow, there's a lot of cover-ups about, we don't know the history that we're like, we actually don't know history at all. Like we think that we are like they tell in a lot of ways, like they don't tell the stories that actually happened. They just kind of summarize in history classes, and you learn like one incident and other incidents, but you're not told about the whole story and the events that actually happened.
What do you think? Because there's so much to cover, in a semester, so to speak, that
That and also political agenda,
Mhm.
because the Cold War was coming and we needed Japan as an ally to fight China. And so you can't say that, like, for example, when I went to school, I knew that Japan was friends with Germany, but I had no idea what they did in World War II.
Yeah.
But
And imagine there's probably stories out there that we will never know. You think about that. Now, is there the website that you have? Do you have a building where people can come in and see displays of the work that you do?
there's so much. I
I can
think
imagine.
if I print, that's going to be hard on printing costs.
Yeah,
And also, like, yeah, I think, but if we have funding for it, I'll definitely want to have some kind of exhibition in the Bay Area to, talk about what we are actually doing.
that's a good question. Or thought, because I was thinking about that. Uh, what we've been talking about, what your interns have been finding. Do you often maybe take time to have a location where you kind of give a presentation about what you do and what you find through your research? And I think more so, I'm curious about the reaction of the audience that hears all this. I mean, how do they receive it? How do they come back to you and say, where else can I find this information? Um, has that ever happened? Will you do that?
Yeah, so we have a pretty active YouTube channel, Pacific Front Untold. James Bradley also comes on. He wrote The Flags of Our Fathers, and he also comes on and talk about his research and his research process when he was writing his books and whatnot. We also talk about what we've been researching on, like, for example, the Quantum Army, which is another chapter of history that I can't believe no one ever wrote about, at least in English. In Chinese, I don't think it's too many books out there for that either. It's basically how Japan planted a false flag event in Manchuria, which led to Japanese invasion of Manchuria. It was like a big incident in 1931 on September 18th. And the League of Nations eventually condemned Japan for it. But then in 1933, Japan just walked out of the League of Nations and said that, we're no longer a member. And that kind of gave Hitler and Mussolini, Mussolini and Hitler saw that and was like, oh, we can just do that? I didn't realize that we could just do that. And so then when you shift the date of World War II to 1931 or when 1933, when Japan just walked out of League of Nations, then you no longer see Japan as a sideshow of World War II. And that's what we've been talking about on our channel for Pacific Front Untold and also some of our other research on there.
Where do you, I mean, you've been at this now, you said you started in 2014, so we're 12 years. Where do you want to take this? What's the next level? I mean, what you've done so far, have you ever thought of and really to amplify this even more so, let's see if we can do the following. Have you given that any thought?
Yeah. Yeah, I would want our YouTube to be more popular, and also maybe we can get a building for an exhibition or museum for in the Bay Area, especially to do that kind of dialogue that you've been talking about, and also show these exhibitions that have been happening, that happened historically, and so then we can show a more wholesome picture of history.
Yeah, because I think your goal of the organization, if I understand correctly, is to bring awareness to the atrocities that were committed, but things that have happened that people had no clue to. And I think that kind of goes back to your uh, the slogan, well, not slogan, but your statement where you said, to remember history, see the future. And I think a lot of people miss that there's that saying, well, history will often repeat itself. And I think it's because what people don't understand or not aware of, as ugly as it can be, and when I see what's happening in the world today, It's like, are we ever going to learn? Because we just seem to be repeating the same mistakes over and over and over, and with different
Yeah.
players.
And it's also interesting because for me, I feel like what a lot of the geopolitical tension that is happening today in Asia also stemmed from World War II. Like 1945 was not a liberating moment. It was just a moment where, as you can see, a lot of Southeast Asian countries tried to decolonize, and then China had a civil war. And so then and then also there were a lot of historical scars that were happening. And like I was mentioning earlier, that Japan has a Yasukuni shrine where they worship war criminals from like World War II. And Kishi Nobusuke was actually one of the war criminal who was even taken out of the Sugamo prison by the United States. And Eisenhower funded him to become the prime minister of Japan within 10 years. And he founded the LDP party, which is still the ruling party today. And his grandson was Shinzo Abe. And Kishi Nobusuke had like written a lot of the policies that enabled Japan to make Manchuria, so their so-called utopia. One of his phrases that he liked to use was like, "Oh, Chinese people are like toilet water, and Japanese people are the pure water, and you cannot commingle the two." And so you can actually even see that policy at play at Unit 731 because there were two incinerators. One is for if the Japanese scientists somehow die doing human experimentation, like sometimes scientific experiments backfire. And the other one is for the general like victim incinerator. And so, yeah, we really need to learn history to not repeat the past mistakes.
Gosh. Um, what has struck you the most, though, during the time that you've been putting all this effort into this organization? Again, I look at the website periodically to see if there's new information, but what have you learned about yourself along the way as you've been collecting all of this key information, history, in trying to, as best as you can, talk to as many survivors as possible before they're gone?
I learned that I was very naive. There was so much work to be done. And that, like, it's very hard too for people who have heard about it for the first time. I have to say that young people are more open minded than like other people who have already established a narrative in their minds. Like, for example, last year, I had a group of high school students who reached out to me to enroll in National History Day about Unit 731. They had heard about it on our website, and I was very surprised to hear that they heard about Unit 731 from our website, winning the first prize at in New Mexico in the state competition. And yeah, and I learned that like history is often cherry picked by like politicians who want to use a certain part of history to prove their point, but then they will never tell you the whole comprehend like the whole full story. It's like, we never really learned in American history that America was a imperial power in a sense, because Teddy Roosevelt even handed Korea to Japan. And that started a lot from Treaty of Portsmouth. And so then when we learn about like Japan had colonized Korea, we don't realize America's involvement. And it's also very fascinating to me that like certain um certain interest groups and certain politicians would want to cherry pick it in a way that like America would look good, or like there are certain countries that will look good. And the reason why I started doing all these primary sources is because a lot of these people they start fighting a war too on social media, and they would accuse and start projecting like this is false, this is incorrect, and whatnot. And so that's why we need to use that kind of primary source documents to show that what we're talking about is not hearsay, is not conspiracy theory, is actually true. That's what happened. And I learned to also like document a lot better in terms of like finding sources, in terms of like um trying to actually fact check and prove what had
Sure.
happened.
Check but verify.
Yeah.
Wow. So,
And it's also very hard to like find information that about Teddy Roosevelt that's kind of like dating. And people would ask me questions like, "Oh, what do you think? Like, do you think Japanese people need to apologize to Chinese people? Blah blah blah. Are you Japan bashing? Why are you guys doing that?" And I mean, you would never ask a Holocaust Center why they're talking about the Holocaust, right? Like, you would never. And like the Nazis, I mean, Germany have acknowledged their past, but the fact that like Japan and Germany have taken such a different approach in encountering the past is very shocking in a way.
so the interns that, I mean, I imagine it's like a revolving door, but as they leave, do they ever share with you what they got out of this?
Yeah.
And yeah, I'd be curious to know. I mean, is there like a theme? It's like, okay, everyone seems to be in agreement that this is what they have learned and what they're going to take away. What is that?
One of my interns who interned for me in last summer said that he was embarrassed about what the United States was doing after figuring out like Unit 731 and trying to get it for Dietrich and whatnot. And basically, it's like a lot of like emotional damage because they unlearn what they have taught from the narrative. Yeah.
That's true. No, it's, I think too, you call out, how politicians will cherry pick stories and how we seem to have a perception of what this another country is about. And you look at like Mao back in China during that time period, and you get a perception here in the United States classroom. But then as you grow up, you begin to realize, well, wait a minute, I never lived there. I don't know what have caused them, the Chinese, to kind of take this path to rebuild themselves. And why do people, support Mao? But I think until you live it, you taste it, you visualize it, then and only then can you truly say, now I understand. And what I've been led to believe isn't what I thought it was.
Right. Exactly.
And I think that's what you're discovering now as you go down these many roads to gather information from those who are still surviving. And I think that, as you say, these young kids who come in, they're more open-minded. I think for them, I think they're going to get a lot out of this because it makes them understand, don't believe everything you hear and read, particularly when you hear it on social media, because everything gets so distorted. By the time it gets handed down from one social media site to another, this story has been completely, obliterated.
Yeah. And also, it does a lot for like survivors too to talk about those kind of stories or like people who have experienced it. One of the survivor, Jean B, that I talked to, from World War II, she survived World War II in China, and she was then later she became like a math professor at Sonoma State University. So her story is incredible. She lost her brother, and it used to be that like she told me that she never talked about it when she was younger, and her late husband brought her to like watch a World War II movie, and she was crying so hard that he had to carry her from like the theater to back to the car because she couldn't even get out of the seat because she was thinking about like, her own war and how she survived. And I have been bringing her to like talk to my interns about her experience. And the first time, she was crying so hard, I was thinking like, oh my God, I don't know what to do. And last year we had a conference and she just dropped like one tear about what had happened. And so in a way, I think she's healing too.
Probably still healing to this very day. I sometimes wonder how individuals back then had the means to survive. It's like, how many days can I take of this? And you just don't know just how strong the human will can be. It's, there's a lot of stories out there that you're finding, a lot of stories you'll never find. I just think if there was one strong point to convey to the audience that's listening to this podcast, what would you want them to understand about what your mission is and what you're trying to make people understand in terms of what has happened in history that we don't know and how that is something we need to bear in mind as we go forward today?
I think that people need to question what they learn in school or on social media or like what happened in places, and just don't trust the media about. Don't take the word for it. For example, people were talking about the Iran revolution and whatnot, and it got me really started wondering about what had happened even before the revolution. And I'm not like pro-regime or whatever. I have no skin in this game, except I'm kind of worried about the petrodollar. Um, and, but then I realized that what had happened is that they had installed the last Shah, Teddy Roosevelt's like grandson, through overthrew democracy in Iran in 1953. And so, they tell you about certain things, but then they don't tell you about, the story that had happened before that. And then they continue using the same headline, telling you that they must restore democracy and whatnot, and then gets us into a whole political mess. So definitely question and look into what happens in the world, or, and basically think about the things that they're not telling you.
That story about Roosevelt, I heard about that on the news a couple of days ago, because the anchor person was calling out, so how did we get here? Well, to explain how we got here, let's go back into history that led to where and what we're seeing today. And it was an eye-opener, because I think like what happened back in, I think it was in the 70s when Iran stormed a U.S. building during Jimmy Carter's presidency, and they took all the prisoners. And he was saying this was the consequence of what happened back then to what is happening back in the 70s. So, history is history, but sometimes history will come alive to say, okay, now it's our turn to tell you how we feel because of what happened in the past. And again,
Yes, and also if you think about it too, like a lot of countries make their policy based on historical trauma. For example, China had gone through a whole century of humiliation. They were addicted to drugs. The West basically carved them up like melon. And so when they're trying to like drum up their military and trying to have more defense power, they're doing it because of their historical trauma that they've lived through and their historical memory. They want to make their country stronger so that they can protect its citizens, so that they don't have to repeat the century of humiliation again. And so I think a lot of it, we need to learn history to understand the context.
Absolutely. So, Jenny, this has been a very eye-opener for me, to be honest with you. I have been going through your website and been looking and listening to some of the videos and some of the content that is on there today, but hearing a little more in-depth insight as to what it takes to pull all this together to tell the story and I guess to tell the real story. Hey, everything you see in the history books is kind of a little bit glossy, but you need to kind of peel the skin of the onion to see there's another story here that you've not been told that led to what you've been reading, and understand that while you may look at something negative, there was a reason why it happened. And I think people need to understand that, to your point, if you don't remember history, we're just going to be spinning our wheels here, and we're never going to learn. So I usually end the show with what I call speed round questions, and just have 5, but I'd like to see if I can get some answers from you. What was the best live concert you ever attended, and why?
When I was younger, I like OK Go. I don't know if you know of the band OK Go. Their
Yeah.
concerts are very fun. They have a lot of like colorful like display in the background. I think that was the best, like one of the best live concerts I've attended.
Well, how long ago was that?
At least like, let me think about it, 15 years ago. It's not the same as like going to an Ed Sheeran concert and you're seeing like the stadium and whatnot. And like, I don't like stadium concerts because I think they're less like, less, you get to interact less.
Okay, here's one. I mean, this might be a good question for you. What do you wish you had more time to do?
To travel, actually.
Really?
I wish I had more time to travel and like see different perspectives. I used to travel quite a lot more. And I used to be really into credit card churning, and so I had all these points, so I can like travel 4 times. And I feel like back in the day, cost of living was lower too, and like the dollar was way stronger when I was traveling. And yeah, I wish I had more time to do that.
Is there a particular country or countries you'd like to see, or if you had the time to, like, I want to go there right now?
I kind of want to see Cambodia. I've been looking at like the architecture and whatnot. I find it very fascinating.
What was your first paying job?
I was a student ambassador at the Young Museum. To cut basically it was to for me, I just find that it was very good because I get to like skip class and do an art lecture for like elementary school students, and I got paid for it. So that was actually a really great job.
Okay, next question. With all the interns that you've met, you got to know them a lot. But if they were to work together and wrote a book about you, what do you think that title would be?
I mean, silences of like stories are not told, and yeah, I'm trying to dig it out and talk about those stories.
Okay, I like that. Okay, last question. Now, what would you do if you knew? What would you attempt to do if you knew you could not fail?
Get people to understand like history and not incidences, but actually like the whole story of like what happened and effects and consequences of actions.
Hmm. I was about to ask you what would be your last parting thought, but I think that captures it right there. Now, I think this was as I said, a very insightful discussion. A lot to learn here, and I will be providing the website for Jenny's website and the organization, their YouTube account. But I really invite you to please go to the website. There is so much information there. Again, things that were very insightful, things I didn't even have a clue as to what was happening or what had happened during that time period of the Pacific War and then Japan and the Chinese. So please, I invite you to go see it. I think you're going to learn a lot and much more. So Jenny, I thank you very much for taking the time to meet with us and sharing your story. And I can't wait to start promoting this site because I think we can all learn a lot from it. And to my audience, I thank you very much for joining us, and we'll talk to you soon.